This is part 2 of making a correct exposure. Exposure compensation. Most cameras will have an exposure compensation button. It's like that plus minus button that you have on your camera, typically on the top, but not always. When pressed, it brings up a display on the bottom, as you see on the bottom, or sometimes just an integer such as plus 1.7. So here, for example, is exposure compensation where 0 is the value. This is 1/3 of a stop underexposed, 2/3 of a stop, 1 full stop, 1 1/3 stops. This is plus 1 2/3 stop overexposed, 2 stops overexposed, and 3 stops overexposed. Please remember that when you turn your exposure compensation on, it stays on forever. You have to turn it off to get it go back to 0. Otherwise, it'll affect all of your shots. How much do I compensate by? So this is one of the questions that comes up. Well, okay, I understand I need to compensate, but by how much? So you should have a basic idea of what's going on. Snow scenes have a lot of white values. Any modest amount of white values typically is going to be a +1 setting. A lot of white values is going to typically be a +2 setting. Use the same guideline for sand and bright skies. It's a good idea to check your picture after taking it to see if more adjustments are necessary. This is a good place to look at a histogram because it provides you a really clear and concise understanding of what's going on. Exposure lock is a second method. Exposure lock typically is either an EL button, typically on the back of your camera, or sometimes a star button, most notably present in Canon cameras. The exposure lock is usually found as a button labeled EL or with an asterisk. You press it and hold it. Now sometimes you press it and it turns on, and you press it and it turns off. Other times you have to press and hold. A symbol will come on in the viewfinder, usually an EL or a star. The trick then is to find the right lighting. So what you're going to do at this moment is, after you've pressed the button and or pressed and hold it, you're going to find that it's going to lock the exposure on it, whatever it was. So as we did before, where you move the camera about, you would lower the camera or zoom in the camera so that you've only got the area that you're interested in, and none of the bright area that is affecting the scene is going to be part of the exposure calculation. The moment you have that, you press and lock the button. And then you reframe the camera according to what you want in the shot, and you take the picture. As soon as you've taken the picture, the lock turns off. This is an advantage over the compensation method because it never turns off unless you do it intentionally. Now, an interesting idea is that you can combine exposure lock and exposure compensation. So in this particular situation, exposure lock on its own may not be enough. So what I would be doing in this situation is I would set my exposure compensation to +1, recognizing that I'm in a moderately light snow area. Then I would lower the camera so the sun's not in the picture and press the exposure lock and then reframe and take the picture. And the combination will give you the shot you're looking for. Again, you can always check histograms. Bracketing. Bracketing is, you may find it as a BKT button. You may find it as a function button, FN. It may be a function that you can program inside the camera. There's a variety of ways that you might be able to bracket. And if all else fails, you can always bracket manually. We'll talk about that in a bit. Cameras equipped with a bracketing function will have the button labeled BKT, or it may be menu driven. An exposure bar may appear, and while pressing the bracket button, turning the command dial allow you to bracket in the amount you wish to bracket. Taking usually 3 photographs allow you to capture a number of images, each one at a different exposure. So at this point, what you have to do is, once you've got your bracketing function set, you take 3 pictures if that's the number of frames you're allowed. And so first picture would be -1, second would be 0, third would be +1. Some cameras even allow you to change that order. You can bracket it manually as well. You have to turn it off after you use it. Otherwise, the next 3 frames will be the same, and so on and so forth. dedicated scene exposure mode. So this is a fourth method of doing this. Some cameras have a variety of different exposure modes. If you want to use full auto, so that you're not comfortable going on to aperture priority or manual or any such thing, you want to use full auto. Check to see if your camera has things like a snow scene or a fireworks scene. Cameras range from none to dozens of fully automatic choices depending upon the model. Common ones include snow, snow and sand, beach, fireworks, sunset, night, night portrait, underwater, and so on. The key on this is to dial in the correct menu choice for your situation. Then there's manual exposure mode. This happens to be a favorite of mine, but it's one that a lot of people that aren't comfortable with the camera in the first place are not likely to try. So the M on your mode dial is for manual exposure. This allows you to set shutter speed and aperture fully independent of each other. I often start in aperture priority, pick an aperture depending upon my goals, and pay attention to what the shutter speed says. Then switching over to manual mode, dial in the recommended shutter speed. After this, it is just a matter of adjusting shutter speed up or down depending upon what the specific situation is. Another possibility here is to use RAW and post correct. So you can see here that this is the RAW program in Photoshop, and I've highlighted the section on exposure. If you look at the histogram at the top, you can see that it's overexposed. It's a little bit flat on the far left, and it's pushing up against the wall on the far right. By playing with the exposure, we can bring that back to give it a much more balanced exposure. RAW files contain more latitude and dynamic range than JPEG. Programs such as Photoshop and Lightroom allow you to adjust the RAW file's exposure and other parameters, allowing some exposure compensation to take place. Once the best variation is achieved, open the file and save it in the desired format. So typically JPEG, but not necessarily. It is always better to bring the best shot you can into these programs, though, instead of relying on them to fix things. In other words, don't go out of your way to assume that the raw image can be corrected post-shot. It's always better to take the best photograph that you can and then make any adjustments inside the program. So do yourself a big favor. Learn to interpret histograms or levels using the simplest methods. That was the trends I did that we talked about, because they will help you improve your photography and post-processing workflow a great deal. Develop an understanding for how an exposure can be wrong and learn to correct the situation before working on the image after it's captured. Learn several exposure alteration techniques, so that would be things like exposure compensation or exposure lock or even manual, so that you can have more than one choice when it comes time to changing things. There are many times an alternative method will work much better for you. Don't be afraid or hesitate to try new techniques. It's how you learn. Take a shot the normal way and then take another shot using a different method. Compare the two, which one turned better. This is a technique I use all the time. I take a photograph, then I change something, and take a second photograph. What's the difference? What did I learn? How can I apply this to other situations? These are some photographs I've taken using exposure compensation or exposure lock or manual, many of the different techniques. All of these have required some adjustment based upon things that are going on inside the image. Typically it's snow, or it's sand, or it's bright reflected areas, or it's background light coming in from the sky or some other situation. All of these things means that you just can't go on average and expect it's going to work out. All of it requires some change. My name is Eric. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you taking the time to look at this presentation.